Whether you're listening under the hum of a ceiling fan or wrapped in a warm blanket with rain on your window, welcome. Tonight, Santa returns not with toys or sleigh bells, but with another true story, one meant to carry you gently into the night. So close your eyes, breathe easy, and let me tell you a tale few ever speak of, but one you'll never forget. Tonight, Santa wants to tell you a tale of fear, power, and every bite that could be your last. Come closer, dear listener, because this is the untold story of the people who tasted death so kings could sleep soundly. Long before the pages of history were filled with conquests, kings, and revolutions, there existed a quieter form of sacrifice, one not immortalized in bronze or ballad, but made with every meal. The story of the royal food taster begins not with glory, but with fear. And it begins, as many things do, at a table. In the earliest records we have, from Mesopotamian clay tablets to Egyptian tombs, the powerful feared one thing more than war or famine: betrayal. And how better to eliminate a ruler than through the one necessity they could not escape? Food. Poison was the weapon of cowards and masterminds alike, used by those who could not storm palaces but could infiltrate kitchens. The solution: a human shield in the most intimate of moments: dining. Thus the role of the food taster emerged, not as a profession of prestige, but as a last line of defense. These were individuals selected not for skill, but for expendability. Slaves, servants, even trusted eunuchs were conscripted into this grim duty. Their job was simple: eat the king's food, wait, and hope to survive. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs, believed to be living gods, nonetheless feared very mortal deaths. At the height of the New Kingdom, court records describe a class of servants known as the mouths, individuals whose sole purpose was to consume portions of the pharaoh's meals. They were housed close to the royal kitchens, under constant surveillance, and were forbidden from speaking to outsiders. Their tongues were their tools, but also their vulnerabilities. One wrong swallow, and the kingdom might mourn 2 deaths in a single day. Yet this was not always seen as a curse. For some, becoming a taster was a step up, closer proximity to power. Better food than commoners ever saw, and the chance, however slim, of catching a ruler's favor. In Rome, where poison became an art form, emperors surrounded themselves with concentric rings of food security. The most notorious, Emperor Claudius, employed both human tasters and a team of chemists who tested his meals for suspicious substances. Still, that didn't stop his wife Agrippina from eventually slipping poison into his favorite mushrooms, reportedly bypassing the testers entirely. The job evolved subtly with each empire. In Persia, food tasters became part of the king's trusted entourage, often drawn from noble families to prevent bribery. In India, under the Maurya Empire, spies known as Vishakanyas, poison maidens, were trained not just in seduction, but in delivering death through touch or taste. Tasters were no match for them. But the true origins of food tasting as an institutional practice came to maturity during the reign of absolute monarchies. As the divine right of kings solidified, across Europe so too did the paranoia of court life. Royal feasts were not just about spectacle, they were calculated displays of dominance, and with every goblet of wine and golden platter served, danger lurked. Poison wasn't just a threat, it was expected. Thus, the food taster became a fixture, often stationed beside the monarch, a human litmus test. The position carried layers of contradiction, simultaneously vital and invisible, both guardian and bait. Some tasters lasted years, becoming silent companions to sovereigns. Others died before their names were ever known. One such figure appears in the chronicles of medieval Hungary, a man named Istvan, who served King Bela IV during the tumultuous 13th century. When Mongol invasions threatened the kingdom, Bela grew increasingly suspicious of his own court. Istvan, a baker's son elevated to the royal kitchens, was tasked with testing every morsel that reached the king's lips. He lasted 5 years, until one evening in winter, a spiced stew sent him convulsing to the floor. Bela survived, but dismissed half his kitchen staff in the days that followed. Istvan was buried in unmarked ground, his story preserved only in the margins of a court scribe's diary. By the time of the Renaissance, food tasting had become ritualized. Ceremonial cupbearers and carvers were assigned to kings and popes, many of whom were trained in poison detection. But the knowledge was primitive. They relied on visual cues, strange odors, unusual colors, or on animal testing. Letting a dog or bird try the food first, humans were still the most reliable detectors of death. The legacy of this grim duty lingers. Even in modern times, world leaders rely on food security units, with some hiring former military or intelligence officers to sample meals during state visits. But the old role of the anonymous servant, praying that breakfast didn't contain betrayal, has faded into legend. And yet the question remains, what did it feel like to live every day knowing that a single bite could be your last? To eat, not for nourishment, but as sacrifice? Tonight we begin to uncover the truth. Not the sanitized versions told in history books, but the quiet lives lived in shadow, beside power, behind golden goblets and jeweled platters. The food tasters of history were more than testers. They were shields. They were witnesses. And too often, they were forgotten. Sleep now, dear listener. The story continues tomorrow night. The Nile was the cradle of one of humanity's most enduring civilizations, where golden temples rose from the sands and gods walked among mortals. But even in a land ruled by divine pharaohs, where the sun itself bowed to royal command, fear seeped into the kitchens. For all their power, the rulers of Egypt harbored a singular, silent dread: death by poison. To understand how deep this fear ran, one must first understand what the pharaohs represented. They were not simply kings, they were Horus incarnate, the intermediaries between gods and men. Their bodies were sacred, their words were law, and their survival meant the continuation of Ma'at, the universal order of balance and harmony. To poison a pharaoh was not merely assassination. It was cosmological sabotage. Yet fear doesn't respect divinity. As Egypt's empire expanded and its court grew more labyrinthine, so too did the threats. Power bred jealousy. Conspiracies fermented. Behind carved pillars and within silk-draped chambers. A subtle hand in the kitchen could accomplish what no enemy army could. And so the profession of the food taster, or at least its earliest version, took root in the shadows of Egypt's grandeur. Historical references to Egyptian food tasters are sparse, veiled in metaphor and buried beneath ceremonial language. But from the fragments that survive, a picture emerges. In the court of Pharaoh Thutmose III, who ruled in the 15th century BCE, an edict preserved on papyrus references a group of purifiers of the table. These men and women were said to swallow the fate of the gods, a poetic way to describe their lethal duty. They tasted oils, wines, meats, and breads before they reached the pharaoh's lips. These tasters lived in a peculiar twilight of privilege and peril. On one hand, they resided within the royal compound, ate better than commoners, and moved in proximity to power. On the other, their existence was entirely transactional, their value measured in heartbeats and stomach reactions. One false mouthful, one unholy mix of herbs or tainted honey, and their lives would end so that the pharaohs might continue. Their training was secretive. Young initiates were selected based on family loyalty, health, and sometimes astrology. They were taught to identify dangerous substances not through science, which did not yet exist in the modern sense, but through scent, texture, color, and ritual. Some were even forced to consume small amounts of known poisons to build resistance, much like future Indian Vishakanyas or medieval royal tasters. Whether this made them safer or simply more expendable remains unclear. But the true terror lay not just in the poisons themselves, but in the silence that surrounded them. Ancient Egyptian poisons were crafted from a variety of ingredients: crushed scorpions, nightshade, arsenic-laced resins, and even tainted fish. The potency of these toxins varied wildly, and often symptoms did not appear immediately. A taster might eat a dish, feel fine, and die the next morning, long after the pharaoh had consumed the same meal. This lag was the killer's advantage, and the taster's curse. So new layers of precaution emerged. Food preparation became almost religious. Bread was baked in ovens purified by incense. Water for wine was drawn from sacred wells. The names of cooks were recorded daily, and each dish was accompanied by a clay tablet detailing its origin. If something went wrong, someone had to answer. Pharaoh Akhenaten, the infamous heretic king, was particularly obsessed with purification. His kitchen staff were required to wear linen masks and wash with natron before touching food. His personal taster, a man named Ippur, according to scattered tomb graffiti, was rumored to have tasted not only the king's meals, but his cosmetics, oils, balms, and lip paints, for fear they too might be tainted. But even this was not enough. Poison could still slip through. In the reign of Ramses III, one of the most dramatic court conspiracies in ancient Egypt unfolded. Though best known for his military victories, Ramses's final years were marred by betrayal. His harem, led by a secondary wife named Tia, plotted to assassinate him and place her son on the throne. The plot involved scribes, guards, and most ominously, a royal cook. According to the judicial papyrus of Turin, poison was indeed part of their plan. Did a food taster die in the process? The records do not say. What we know is that Ramses III was eventually killed, his throat cut, not poisoned. But the very presence of chefs and kitchen staff in the plot reveals just how close danger could lurk, and how vital and vulnerable food tasters truly were. Their sacrifices were never commemorated. No statues were carved in their honor. Their tombs, if they had them, bore no inscriptions of bravery. In death, they returned to anonymity, absorbed back into the desert winds that once whispered through palace halls. And yet, their presence shaped the rituals of power. Every time a pharaoh dined, it was not just a meal. It was a ceremony of trust, fear, and control. The taster knelt. The food was sampled. A pause. Eyes watched for tremors, for sweat, for the slow clutch of the stomach. Only then did the ruler lift his golden spoon. There's a strange intimacy in this moment, between taster and king, poisoner and victim, cook and conspirator. Each bite held the potential for betrayal or survival. In later dynasties, especially as Egypt began to decline and foreign rulers claimed the throne, the practice of food tasting became even more secretive. Greek generals, Persian satraps, and Roman governors who ruled from Alexandria brought their own customs and their own fears. But the idea remained. A ruler must be protected from within, because death often came not with a sword, but with a slice of melon. So what does this ancient paranoia tell us? Perhaps that even the most powerful understand how fragile life is, that trust is a currency as valuable as gold, and that the smallest gesture, a bite of bread taken before another, can carry the weight of a kingdom. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the corridors of a palace bathed in torchlight. A servant, young and quiet, takes a sip from a royal cup. The room stills. Time waits, and somewhere a god watches. Sleep now, dear listener. The desert winds have carried this story across time, and there are many more bites to come. The Roman Empire prided itself on order, law, and civilization. But beneath the marble facades and military triumphs pulsed a constant undercurrent of fear. In the palaces of emperors and senators, death came not only by dagger, but often through the delicate artistry of cuisine. And for those tasked with guarding against it, the imperial food tasters, Rome was the most dangerous dining room in the ancient world. Rome loved food. Lavish banquets were not just entertainment, they were power plays, demonstrations of status, intellect, and control. A Roman feast could last for hours, sometimes days, with multiple courses. Exotic birds, honeyed dormice, fish fermented in garum, rare fruits from Africa, and spices from India. But for all the opulence, there was always a silent tension at the table. Everyone knew that death could be salted into a dish just as easily as saffron. Emperors were particularly paranoid, and with good reason. Poisoning in Rome had become a perfected weapon by the late Republic. The infamous Lex Cornelia de Sicarius et Veneficius, a law targeting poisoners and assassins, was passed in 81 BCE. But rather than stamping out the problem, it merely acknowledged how prevalent it had become. Death by poison was discreet, deniable, and terrifying. It allowed enemies to strike without drawing blood or sword. To defend against this invisible threat, Roman elites began appointing praegustatores, professional food tasters. These individuals sampled each item prepared for the emperor or patrician host. They tasted wine from ceremonial goblets, nibbled fruit from ivory bowls, and tested sauces with silver spoons. But unlike later medieval tasters, the Roman praegustator was often a slave or freedman, someone considered expendable. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, was known to employ such tasters, especially after surviving multiple assassination attempts. Suetonius in the 12 Caesars recounts how Augustus dined simply and often with close friends, but never without his food being tested first. His caution was not paranoia, it was survival. Tiberius, his successor, took it further. His villa on the island of Capri was a fortress of isolation. Servants were vetted with scrutiny, and the kitchen was a secured domain. Every dish was inspected, tasted, and then presented with trembling hands. Tiberius was not a man known for trust, but it was Emperor Claudius who perhaps best exemplifies the futility of these measures. A scholarly, awkward figure often underestimated. By his peers, Claudius surrounded himself with food tasters, physicians, and even proto-chemists to guard his meals. He insisted on silver utensils, believed to change color in the presence of poison, and had dishes tasted multiple times by different individuals. Yet still he died. The culprit? Mushrooms, or more specifically his fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was not merely ambitious, and she was brilliant and lethal. According to Tacitus, she bypassed the food tasters by preparing the dish herself, using a special blend of poison that mimicked natural illness. Whether it was the taster's oversight or Agrippina's cunning remains unclear, but Claudius died shortly after, and her son Nero took the throne. This assassination sent shockwaves through Rome. If even a man surrounded by layers of protection could be killed with a single bite, what hope did anyone have? Nero, ever the dramatist, responded with excess. His food tasters were doubled. Meals were prepared in multiple kitchens. Some historians suggest that he even had his tasters tested, feeding them potentially poisoned food to see if they reacted, ensuring they weren't secretly immune and in league with conspirators. But the job of a food taster in Rome was not purely reactive. These individuals also had to navigate the complex rituals of Roman dining. A taster couldn't simply bite and wait. They were expected to understand flavors, recognize inconsistencies, and often serve as culinary consultants. Poison might hide in a spoiled fish sauce, in a pastry with an unusual texture, or in wine that tasted just slightly too bitter. And the methods of poisoning were evolving. Some favored natural toxins, belladonna, hemlock, aconite, which could cause anything from hallucinations to paralysis. Others employed exotic venoms from snakes or toads. A few even turned to alchemy, experimenting with metals like arsenic and mercury. Each had its telltale signs, but in the hands of a skilled poisoner, detection was nearly impossible. For food tasters, this was a life of constant dread. Even a false alarm, a stomachache from spoiled meat, could spell doom. If a taster died, the kitchen staff might be tortured. If a dish passed inspection and still harmed the emperor, everyone from cook to cupbearer faced execution. And yet, there were moments of elevation. Some tasters, through loyalty and survival, gained the emperor's trust. A freedman named Halotus, who served Claudius, was said to have remained close to Nero after the assassination. Another, Crispinus, became a minor court official, rewarded for years of vigilance. But these were exceptions, not the rule. Most tasters disappeared into the margins of history, unnamed, unmourned. Rome's obsession with food and death bled into its entertainment. Plays featured poisoners. Poets wrote verses about treacherous dinners. Even the infamous Satyricon by Petronius includes scenes mocking gluttony and paranoia. Everyone knew that the next course could be your last. As the empire expanded, new foods and new poisons entered Roman kitchens. Spices from the east masked the scent of bitter herbs. Wines from Gaul carried unfamiliar notes. The complexity of cuisine became a playground for those who sought to kill without being seen. Eventually, the role of the food taster diminished. As emperors became more insulated and distant from public life, their exposure decreased. Poisonings still occurred, but the rituals surrounding tasting faded. What remained was the legacy, a reminder that even the most powerful could be undone by what they loved most, a decadent meal. Today, when we speak of Roman feasts, we remember the excess. The fountains of wine, the endless courses, the gold and marble. But behind every goblet lifted by an emperor, there stood a figure in the shadows, a man or woman who had already tasted it, already risked everything. Their names are gone, their stories are whispers, but their presence was as vital as any general or senator. They were the silent sentinels of the empire's appetite, and every bite they took was a gamble against history. Sleep now, dear listener. The streets of Rome may have crumbled, but the taste of treachery lingers still. In the vast palaces of ancient China, where emperors were considered sons of heaven, food was never just nourishment. It was ceremony, diplomacy, power, and danger. As dynasties rose and fell, Qin, Han, Tang, Song, Ming, Qing, one fear remained, constant through the centuries, that the next bite could end an empire. No ruler in the ancient world was as shielded, as ritualized, or as suspicious as a Chinese emperor. Their meals were both sacred and secretive, and to protect them, an elaborate system evolved, far beyond the mere appointment of a food taster. What emerged was an entire invisible bureaucracy of surveillance, purification, and silent sacrifice. Unlike their Western counterparts, Chinese emperors rarely employed a single food taster. That would have been too obvious, too easily corrupted, too human. Instead, they relied on a network, dozens of individuals, each responsible for a layer of protection. And each one knew, if something went wrong, death would follow swiftly. It began in the imperial kitchens, a labyrinth of stone and wood located deep within the Forbidden City during the Ming and Qing dynasties. This complex could span dozens of buildings and house hundreds of chefs, stewards, and testers. Meals were planned days in advance. Ingredients were logged, weighed, and sealed upon arrival. Fresh vegetables were inspected by eunuchs trained in botany. Meats came from trusted farms. Water was drawn from special wells known to be free from mineral contamination. Before any food reached the emperor, It passed through three major stages of verification. Ingredient surveillance. Each item was recorded in a ledger. The person who delivered it, the person who prepared it, and the person who inspected it. All their names were logged. If a dish later proved tainted, these names would be called before a tribunal. Shadow tasting. Rather than a single food taster, dishes were often tested by 3 to 5 low-ranking palace servants, rotated daily to prevent bribery. They sampled the food at regular intervals and were observed for signs of illness. If they survived several hours without symptoms, the dish was approved. Spiritual protection. In certain dynasties, particularly during the Tang and Song periods, food was presented with incantations or placed briefly before household shrines. Buddhist or Taoist monks might bless the meals. Some dishes included protective charms, carved from jade or inscribed on silk tucked beneath the serving plates. Even then, there were fail-safes. The emperor's main meal was often duplicated. 2 identical trays, prepared in different kitchens by separate staff. One was presented for inspection. The other, if the first passed all tests, would be served. Still, danger lingered. Chinese history is replete with assassination attempts via poison. The Ziji Tongjian, an 11th century chronicle of Chinese history, records an attempt on Emperor Guangwu of Han, whose tea was laced with toxic herbs. A junior steward noticed the strange color and raised alarm, only to be executed for speaking, out of turn. The emperor later commended him posthumously, but the message was clear: speak carefully, die silently. Sometimes, poisoning wasn't intended for death, but for control. Certain concubines or eunuchs slipped narcotics into the emperor's diet to make him drowsy, confused, or pliable to suggestion. One infamous example involved consort Zhao during the reign of Emperor Wuzong of Tang. She fed him a concoction laced with poppy extract, creating dependency. For months, court decisions bore her fingerprints. The emperor's tea, in particular, was sacred. Prepared in its own building, with its own staff, it was subject to more scrutiny than some state affairs. Tea was steeped in silver pots, believed to neutralize toxins. The final infusion was tasted by 3 servants, one from the kitchen, one from the eunuch staff, and one from the Ministry of Rites. Only after 3 hours would the emperor be allowed to drink, and the emperor never ate alone. Meals were served under the gaze of guards and ministers. Each dish was covered until unveiled at the moment of presentation. The emperor selected which dish to eat, not based on hunger, but on instinct, safety, or ritual. Some dishes remained untouched, acting as decoys. Others were swapped mid-meal. Without warning, despite all these precautions, some emperors still fell. Emperor Yongzheng of the Qing dynasty, for example, died suddenly and under mysterious circumstances in 1735. Though officially declared a stroke, rumors swirled for centuries about poisoned elixirs. Yongzheng had been obsessed with Taoist immortality, often consuming divine medicines containing mercury and arsenic. Whether his death was sabotage or self-inflicted remains unknown, but the irony was bitter. The quest for eternal life ended in a fatal brew. Perhaps the most tragic story, however, comes from a nameless boy. During the reign of Emperor Renzong of Song, a young servant in the imperial kitchen was tasked with tasting the emperor's favorite winter melon soup. Within minutes of sampling it, he collapsed. The court was thrown into chaos. Investigations revealed a toxic mold had grown in one of the storage jars. The boy's family was compensated with gold, and his name was recorded in the royal archives, but no monument was raised. His death was both expected and accepted. Over time, the system grew more sophisticated. The Ming Dynasty introduced food almanacs, tracking which ingredients were in season, which might harbor natural toxins during certain months, and which combinations were deemed risky. Tasting protocols became doctrine, but with protocol came fear. Kitchen staff lived under constant surveillance. They could not leave the palace. Their letters were read. Their families were often relocated near the capital to prevent blackmail. If a single dish caused illness, dozens might be executed. Cooks, cleaners, record keepers. One slip of ginger, one spot of mold, one unwashed ladle, and a generation of knowledge might disappear overnight. In the final centuries of imperial rule, as China faced external threats and internal corruption, these systems began to crumble. Emperors grew detached. The Forbidden City became a place of stagnation, and the role of the food taster, once a sacred trust, became a ghost job, performed out of habit more than belief. But in their prime, the invisible servants of safety shaped not just palace life, but the very heartbeat of the empire. They taught us that trust is a ritual, that survival is often invisible, and that the quietest hands, those that cook, that stir, that sample, often carry the heaviest burden. So tonight, as the world outside your window slows, picture a palace cloaked in mist. Picture a steaming bowl of rice, untouched, waiting. And picture the eyes of a servant, scanning it for secrets only he is trained to see. Sleep now, dear listener. The emperor's plate is empty, but the story continues. In the flickering torchlight of medieval castles, where stone walls echoed with the chants of monks and the clash of steel, a quieter ritual unfolded each day, the ritual of the royal meal. And within that ritual, beneath the clatter of pewter, dishes, and the wafting scent of roasted meats, worked the silent guardians of the table, the royal food tasters. To eat at a medieval king's table was to dine in the theater of power. Feasts were political acts performed for guests, vassals, and visiting nobles. Each goblet of wine raised, each bread broken, each course presented in gold-trimmed glory, all served to reinforce the monarch's authority and divine favor. But beneath the surface shimmered a fear as old as thrones themselves. Poison. The medieval world was built on hierarchy and oaths, but betrayal was never far. Ambitious barons, foreign spies, disinherited cousins, all could strike from the shadows. And in an age where murder could be masked as stomach illness, poisoning became the weapon of the cunning. This fear birthed a practice both brutal and banal, having someone else taste the food first. In most European courts from the 9th to 15th centuries, the role of food taster was embedded within a broader structure. The Lord Steward, the master of the household, and the royal cupbearer oversaw the flow of food and drink. But the actual tasting? That fell to a low-ranking servant, often a young man from a loyal family, trained not in cooking but in survival. These tasters were not chosen at random. Loyalty was key. In England, it was common for the food taster to be the son of a minor noble who had pledged fealty to the crown. This created a double bond. If the taster died, it was a tragedy, but also a reminder that loyalty ran deeper than fear. In France, the role was sometimes filled by monks, seen as incorruptible. In the Holy Roman Empire, the court maintained a rotating list of trusted knights who would take a single bite before the emperor ate. But unlike later ceremonial tasters, these men had no illusion of safety. They knew the risks. Consider the case of Dietrich of Thuringia, who served Emperor Frederick II in the 13th century. Dietrich had been a page, then a squire, and eventually appointed as the emperor's tongue of faith, a poetic title for one who would eat and wait. One autumn, during a feast in Palermo, Dietrich sampled a goose stew. Minutes later, he turned pale and collapsed. The emperor did not touch his plate. Dietrich died that night. The stew had been laced with henbane. The kitchen staff were executed. The plot was never traced. To protect against such fates, European courts turned to ritual and superstition. Silver utensils were standard, believed to tarnish in contact with poison. A dish that discolored silver was discarded. Salt was used liberally, both as flavor and symbol. In biblical tradition, it represented purity and preservation. Tasting salt was a gesture of loyalty. To eat the king's salt was to swear allegiance. Churchmen added another layer. In Christian belief, poison was often seen as the devil's tool. Thus, prayers were said over meals. Holy water was sprinkled in kitchens. Some kings employed confessors to bless dishes before they reached the table. And if food poisoning still occurred, it was seen not as failure, but divine punishment. The logistics of tasting varied. In smaller courts, the taster ate alongside the monarch, beginning his meal 5 to 10 minutes earlier. In larger courts, the process was more formal. Each course, from roasted boar to custard tarts, was presented, tasted, and observed. If the taster remained well after several minutes, the dish was passed to the king. But poison was clever. Some substances acted slowly, others mimicked indigestion. A taster could feel fine, while the king perished hours later. This led to overlapping protections. Some monarchs had multiple tasters. Others used animals, dogs, birds, to sample raw ingredients. In Scotland, court records mention trained ravens kept for testing wine. And yet, the system was flawed. Poisoners adapted. They used doses too small to kill a taster, but fatal over time for the king. They targeted sauces instead of meats. They smeared toxins onto cutlery. The most infamous cases often came not from enemies, but from within. King John of England, for example, was rumored to have poisoned his nephew Arthur to secure his claim to the throne. Though evidence is thin, the story reveals a deeper truth. When power is at stake, even the royal kitchen can become a battlefield. Some tasters became heroes. Guillaume de Montfort, a knight in the court of Louis the Mine, reportedly detected a poisoned fig by smell alone. He warned the king, who dismissed the dish. The cook fled and was captured. Guillaume was granted lands for his service. But most tasters were not so lucky. Their role was invisible. Their death, if it came, was quick and often unremarked. A taster who fell ill was whisked away. Another would take his place by the next meal. No eulogy, no monument. Just another body between the king and the grave. By the 14th century, the job had become ceremonial in some regions. In Spain and parts of Italy, nobles dined with a theatrical taster, a reminder of vigilance rather than a true safeguard. But in times of crisis, war, succession, intrigue, the real tasting resumed. The fear never died, only slept. Even monarchs who trusted their inner circle couldn't ignore the threat. Charles VI of France, plagued by mental illness and paranoia, refused to eat unless each item had been tasted 3 times, once by a servant, once by a priest, and once by his physician. Meals took hours. No one dared question him. And yet, in the end, his greatest threats came not from poison, but from his own mind. What then did it mean to be a taster in the Middle Ages? It meant waking each day knowing that death could come, with dessert. It meant loyalty not just in battle, but at the dinner table. It meant being a human shield, not with armor, but with appetite. They weren't remembered as heroes. Their names rarely made it into the chronicles. But they were there, at every coronation, every feast, every secret council dinner. Watching, waiting, swallowing danger so others wouldn't have to. So tonight, as the wind howls past stone battlements, long turned to ruin, think of them. The boys with trembling hands, the monks with steady eyes, the knights who bit first. Their sacrifice was small, but it held kingdoms together. Sleep now, dear listener. The meal is done, but history's table is far from cleared. The Palace of Versailles shimmered like a jewel upon the French countryside, a monument to absolute monarchy, grandeur, and divine right. But behind the gold leaf and mirrored halls, beneath the symphony of courtiers and candles, the kitchens of Versailles pulsed with quiet urgency. Because in this empire of appearances, one truth lingered like a bitter aftertaste. Power was fragile, and poison had no scent. France under Louis XIV, the Sun King, was an age of ritual. Every motion of the monarch, from his awakening to his final sip of wine at night, was governed by ceremony. And nothing was more ceremonial or more paranoid than dining. The king's meals weren't just sustenance, they were spectacles, meticulously staged for hundreds of eyes. And yet, it was in this very spectacle that risk took root. With enemies foreign and domestic, and the constant hum of intrigue in the court's air, Versailles employed one of the most complex food security systems ever seen in Europe. And at its heart stood the garde-manger, the officier de bouche, and the goûteurs du roi, the king's official food tasters. Unlike medieval practices where a single servant might bite and pray, Versailles' food tasting was a process built into the very architecture of royal life. It began not with the cook, but with the intendant de la maison du roi, the royal household director. Each day's menu was decided not by hunger, but by protocol. The king's health, astrological signs, and availability of ingredients were all considered. Once approved, the chain of command began. The food would be prepared in kitchens that were both grand and separated. Versailles featured multiple cooking wings, one for the royal family, one for ambassadors, one for courtiers. The king's meals were prepared in the petite cuisine, where only a select few cooks, many drawn from noble families themselves, were allowed entry. From the moment ingredients entered the palace grounds, they were tagged, weighed, and recorded. Live animals were inspected by royal veterinarians. Produce was washed in filtered spring water. Every dish was accounted for, every scrap logged in leather-bound kitchen journals. A missing turnip could raise suspicion. A mislabeled flask of wine could result in punishment. But the tasting began before the food left the kitchen. Members of the goûteurs du roi, often valets or junior courtiers, sampled each dish under supervision. They did not merely eat, they observed. The color, smell, texture, all were scrutinized. If something seemed off even slightly, the dish was discarded. If all appeared normal, the taster would consume a full portion. And wait. Time was built into the schedule for observation. Each tasting was recorded, and the goûteur was required to remain within view of the valet de chambre du roi, the king's personal chamber servant, for at least 1 hour post-meal. Any sign of illness, even a stomach cramp or faintness, was noted and investigated. These men were young, healthy, and trained to detect the subtle onset of symptoms: sweating, dizziness, numbness of the lips. Once a dish passed this first stage, it was placed on a silver tray, covered with a silk cloth, and sealed with a wax stamp bearing the royal crest. The tray was then escorted by guards, often members of the garde du corps, from the kitchen to the king's private dining chamber. There, a second tasting took place. This was the ceremonial layer. Before the king arrived, the grand maître d'hôtel, a noble responsible for the royal table, would remove the wax seal in front of witnesses. Then the chief taster, always in immaculate court dress, would sample a bite from each covered dish. This performance was designed not only to assure the king, but to remind the watching courtiers that loyalty was theatrical, and trust was earned daily. Finally, the king would enter. Seated at the head of a table often set for one, with an aged audience watching from behind velvet ropes, Louis XIV would dine slowly, deliberately. He never served himself. Everything was handed to him, tasted, and tracked. Even the wine was poured from crystal decanters rinsed in holy water. Despite all this, the threat remained. Court records from the Bibliothèque Nationale reveal a curious episode in 1702. A dish of pigeon pie caused the chief taster, a man named Etienne de Castillon, to vomit moments after tasting it. The pie was withdrawn, the cook imprisoned, and the king's dinner replaced with bread and water. No poison was found. It had simply spoiled. But the ripple effect was profound. New guidelines were issued. No game meat more than 1 day. Bold. All pastry fillings to be double-checked by 3 separate stewards. Trust was a living document, rewritten with each mistake. In Versailles, even air was suspect. During certain seasons, windows were kept closed during meals to prevent poisoned drafts. Flowers were removed from dining areas, lest a rival use powdered toxins hidden in petals. Perfumes were banned in food-serving zones. The fear was constant, and not without basis. Rumors swirled endlessly. That the Duchesse de Chevreuse once tried to poison Queen Marie-Thérèse with a candied almond. That Spanish courtiers slipped laudanum into the Dauphin's wine to dull his wit. None proven, all believed. Outside of Versailles, in lesser chateaux and provincial courts, the same rituals were attempted with fewer resources and more improvisation. Food tasters were often peasants, bribed with coin or privilege. Their survival depended not just on loyalty, but on luck. But Versailles was different. It was a machine built to protect a single man's life, a machine of marble, mirrors, and mouths, and the tasters were its first line of defense. What did they gain? Some rose. A few, like Castillon, became minor nobles, granted lands for long service. Others faded into the background. One taster, recorded only as Pierre L., in the archives, served the crown for 28 years. He survived 6 incidents of suspected poisoning. He died not by poison, but by slipping on a wet floor near the royal kitchen. His obituary was 4 lines long. Still, their role endured, because in Versailles, everything meant something. Every gesture, every plate, every flavor. And if a king was to remain divine in the eyes of his subjects, he had to eat with confidence. Confidence built on the quiet, watchful work of men who swallowed first. So tonight, as you rest beneath electric light instead of chandeliers, know that long ago, another man stood in a golden hallway, tasted from a dish that wasn't his, and waited for his heart to beat, or to stop. Sleep now, dear listener. The Sun King has finished his supper, but our feast of stories is far from over. The Topkapi Palace stood like a jeweled sentinel over the Bosphorus, where east met west and empires whispered through silk walls. Beneath its domes and mosaics, where eunuchs shuffled and scribes recorded the divine will of sultans, a quiet game unfolded every evening, and not of chess or conquest, but of trust, loyalty, and food. In the Ottoman Empire, food was diplomacy. Every meal served in the harem or divan was a negotiation of power, lineage, and legacy. And at the center of this complex dance stood a figure both privileged and imperiled. The Cheshnitschi, the imperial food taster. Unlike the low-born tasters of medieval Europe, the Cheshnitschi was not a disposable servant. He was often a palace insider, a eunuch, a janissary, or even a member of the imperial kitchen staff chosen for discretion, training, and absolute loyalty. He lived within the palace complex, isolated from the outside world, and operated under a set of unwritten laws that governed not just taste, but survival. The Cheshnitschi's job was simple in theory, but treacherous in practice. Taste every dish, every drink, every sweet placed before the Sultan. But in reality, he was more than a tester. He was a silent witness to the most intimate moments of power. He stood behind the Sultan's chair during private meals. He observed which wives sent which dishes. He noted which viziers declined to eat. He memorized who cooked what and how the Sultan reacted. The Cheshnitschi was not just tasting for poison. He was tasting for politics. Ottoman cuisine was itself an empire. Dishes from the Balkans, Persia, Arabia, and North Africa mingled. On silver trays, the Sultan's table groaned with roasted meats, saffron rice, honeyed fruits, and spiced sherbets. And while the Sultan enjoyed this bounty, the Cheshnitschi stood with his hands behind his back, eyes scanning the room, stomach churning not from hunger, but from the knowledge that any bite could be a trap. Poisoning was feared in Topkapi, but it was rarely spoken of. It was considered un-Islamic, cowardly, unworthy of a warrior empire. And yet, stories persisted. There was the tale of Mustafa the Younger, the brother of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who died mysteriously after a feast in his honor. Whispers blamed a jealous vizier. No arrest was made. Or Roxolana, the Ukrainian consort who rose to become Hurrem Sultan, wife to Suleiman. She was accused by rival wives of poisoning dishes sent to her stepson, Prince Mehmed. Again, no proof. Just silence. But the most chilling story is that of Hassan el-Karasi, chief Chechnichi under Sultan Murad III. Hassan was a man of discipline. A eunuch raised in the palace since childhood, he had served for over 20 years, his tongue trained to detect the bitter tingle of arsenic, the metallic aftertaste of copper sulfate, the numbness of powdered opium. He kept detailed logs of each meal, including which courtier had gifted it, and it was this habit that proved his undoing. One evening, during a feast marking the return of a victorious general, Hassan tasted a stuffed eggplant dish and immediately felt something wrong. Not pain, not poison, but heat, more intense than expected, followed by dizziness. He gestured discreetly to a steward. The dish was removed. Later that night, after vomiting in private, Hassan reported the incident to the Kapi Aga, the head of the black eunuchs. But the next morning, the dish appeared again, slightly altered. Same sender, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa. This time, Murad himself asked why the dish had been set aside. Hassan, bound by protocol, explained cautiously. Murad nodded, said nothing, ate something else. 3 days later, Hassan was found dead in his chambers. No autopsy, no investigation, just a note in the palace register. Chechnichi Hassan, deceased, replaced. Did he die from poison? Or from knowing too much? Was he the target of an assassin? Or of the Sultan's own growing mistrust? In the Ottoman court, trust was transactional. No one was above suspicion. The Sultan himself lived behind layers of protocol. Food was served by one hand, tasted by another, and observed by a third. Meals were delivered on covered trays by the Matba-i-Amir, the imperial kitchen unit, and watched by the inner court guard. Sometimes the Sultan would refuse all food and request something spontaneous, forcing the kitchens into panic. Not because of hunger, but to test loyalty. If someone reacted too quickly, too conveniently, it raised red flags. The Chechnichi, caught in the middle, had to taste what he did not know from a kitchen he did not see, for a ruler who may or may not have been watching, and sometimes the taster was bait. Sultans, wary of disloyal courtiers, would offer food to viziers or concubines. If they hesitated, if they fell ill, if they acted guilty, consequences followed. A meal could be a trial, a feast, a purge. The Chechnichi wasn't just protecting the Sultan. He was gathering evidence. But the position came with strange privileges. The Chechnichi ate better than most. He was given private rooms, silk robes, and access to secret court corridors. He answered only to the chief steward, and in extreme cases to the Sultan himself. His words carried weight, his silence more. And yet, despite this power, he could not show ambition. To want more was to be suspected. To be too cautious was to seem afraid. Balance was everything. He must appear humble but alert, loyal but detached. A shadow behind the throne. By the 17th century, as the empire aged and grew bureaucratic, the role of the Chechnichi became ceremonial. Meals were pre-approved by physicians, and alchemical testing began to replace human tasting. But even then, the memory of men like Hassan lingered. In the dusty ledgers of Topkapi's archives, his name appears only once more, a line scratched out, erased, forgotten. But we remember. Because history is not just made by sultans and warriors. but by those who stood beside them, quietly, faithfully, fatally. So tonight, as moonlight brushes your window, imagine a golden dish carried through marble halls, its scent rich and inviting. A man in silk tastes it first. His lips part. His fate is sealed. Sleep now, dear listener. The palace sleeps. But the watchers never do. In the land of endless winters and gilded palaces, where czars ruled by divine right and enemies vanished with the frost, food was never just sustenance, it was survival. The Romanovs dined in splendor, gold-plated flatware, crystal goblets, beluga caviar, and game hunted from imperial forests. But beneath the chandeliers of the Winter Palace and the whispers of the Kremlin, there always lingered a darker scent, the ghost of poison. Russia's history is soaked in suspicion. Intrigue did not whisper in corners. It thundered through dynasties. Brothers betrayed brothers, ministers plotted coups, even children were crowned and then killed. And in a world where death could come from within the palace walls, eating became a ritual of defense. At the heart of this ritual stood the royal food taster, nameless, faceless, forgotten. In the time of Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, fear became a form of governance. Ivan trusted no one, not even himself. His paranoia was legend, his cruelty biblical. And when it came to food, he was meticulous to the point of madness. The Tsar dined only after his oprobshchiki, his personal guard and secret police, had inspected the kitchens. Dishes were prepared by cooks who could not leave, the compound who slept beside their ovens, and before Ivan so much as smelled his stew, it was tasted by a man whose name was never spoken aloud. This taster, chosen from the oprichnina ranks, was watched by two others. He ate under silence, hands visible at all times. If he flinched, the food was discarded. If he grew ill, the kitchen staff were executed. If he died, his name was crossed out, and another man took his place. According to folklore, which in Russia is often more reliable than official records, Ivan once had a dozen dishes prepared, each tested, but none consumed. "Let death grow hungry," he is said to have muttered, "while I choose when to eat." But Ivan was only the beginning. Under the Romanovs, food remained sacred and suspect. Peter the Great, obsessed with modernity and efficiency, reformed the imperial kitchens, introducing Western standards and reducing the influence of mystical food testers. He preferred physicians and chemical tests. But still, during his travels, he kept a personal taster, drawn from his military guard, who traveled with him like a shadow. Peter drank heavily and ate simply. Black bread, pickled herring, vodka, but even these were monitored. One aide wrote, "He trusts the bottle more than the men who carry it." But perhaps no Russian ruler faced the full theater of food and treachery quite like Catherine the Great. As empress, Catherine walked a delicate line, a woman ruling a man's empire, a foreign-born queen in a nation of Slavs, and a monarch whose lovers became enemies as often as they became ministers. Her court was a glittering powder keg, and the kitchen was no exception. Catherine's meals were a performance. She dined late, often after midnight, surrounded by musicians and confidants. Each dish, from pierogi to roasted goose, was prepared by a team of French-trained chefs under Russian command. But before it reached her plate, it passed through a layer of defense. The Degustatornaya Komanda, the Royal Tasting Brigade. This team, composed of 5 young men and 1 physician, rotated daily. They tasted from each dish and recorded their physical responses every 15 minutes for the next hour. One document from 1776 details how a taster reported mild burning on the tongue after sampling a custard. The custard was destroyed, the chef whipped, and the empress dined on soup instead. Catherine also employed a tea taster, a role unique to her reign. Tea, newly popular from China, was considered both exotic and risky. The taster, always female, sat near the Empress and sipped first. One such taster, Tatiana Vlasova, reportedly saved Catherine's life when she refused to drink a particular blend that had been gifted by a Prussian ambassador. The tea was later found to contain traces of belladonna. Tatiana was promoted to lady-in-waiting and given a silver samovar, but not all tastings were so honorable. During the reign of Tsar Paul I, Catherine's unpopular and volatile son, food, became a symbol of resistance. Paul was erratic, angry, and convinced everyone wanted him dead. He banned imports, changed menus weekly, and once ordered that only dishes prepared in front of him would be consumed. He had his taster, a Cossack, named Ruslan, stand beside him during every meal. One night, Ruslan hesitated before tasting a duck pâté. Paul accused him of cowardice and had him whipped in front of the court. The next day, Ruslan served the meal, tasted it without flinching, and died an hour later. Paul wept, but he did not stop eating. By the time of Nicholas I, the empire had expanded, but so had the fear. Poisonings became more sophisticated, more political. Revolutionaries no longer stormed gates, they infiltrated kitchens. The food taster became part of the imperial security apparatus, working with the Third Section, Russia's secret police. Meals were analyzed, ingredients traced to origin farms. Even the salt was tested. In a famous episode from 1833, Nicholas refused to eat a fish dish sent from the Caucasus, claiming it smelled of treason. His taster, a young man named Mikhail, insisted it was safe. The Tsar ordered him to eat the entire meal. Mikhail complied and survived. The dish was preserved in a sealed jar and is still kept, legend says, in the archives of the Kremlin, as a warning or a trophy. Eventually, science caught up. By the late 19th century, Russia's imperial kitchens employed chemists. Food was tested for toxins in laboratories before tasting. But the human shield remained, because no test was faster than a heartbeat. When the Romanov dynasty fell in 1917, the revolutionaries executed the Tsar and his family, not with poison, but with bullets. But for centuries, it had been the dinner table, not the battlefield, where empires stood on the edge of oblivion. The royal food tasters of Russia left behind no memoirs. Their names are scattered through footnotes and forgotten files. But their work, their quiet, loyal terror, shaped every imperial meal, every treaty signed on a full stomach, every alliance toasted in vodka and fear. Tonight, as snow drifts, outside your home, or perhaps just the silence of midnight, imagine a silver plate being lowered in front of a throne. A hand reaches, not for the fork, but for a taster. And somewhere, far beneath the frost, something stirs. Sleep now. Dear listener, the Tsars are gone, but their table still remembers. Throughout history, the powerful have gathered at lavish tables to assert their dominance. Golden platters, flowing wine, laughter echoing off marble walls. And yet, amid the glittering performance of royalty, politics, and empire, one truth endures. The closer you dine to power, the nearer you sit to death. This chapter is not about rituals or protocol. It is not about the food tasters who stood in the shadows. Tonight we walk among those who did not survive the first bite. Kings, queens, popes, generals, all brought low not by sword, but by spoon. Let us begin with Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, dead at 32. His demise remains a mystery debated by historians. Fever, typhoid, malaria. But one persistent theory endures: poisoned wine. During a celebratory banquet in Babylon, Alexander reportedly drank a large bowl of unmixed wine, a Macedonian tradition, then collapsed. Witnesses said he cried out in pain. Over the next few days, he grew weaker, unable to speak or move. Some believe the wine was tainted with hellebore, a plant known to cause violent stomach convulsions. Others say arsenic. Still others suspect the poison wasn't in the drink, but in his favorite figs offered by a general with too much ambition. Regardless, the great conqueror died not on a battlefield, but after a meal. Centuries later, across the Mediterranean, another leader would fall at the dinner table. Claudius, emperor of Rome, feared poison more than war. He employed food, tasters, chemists, and silver cutlery. Yet even he could not escape betrayal. According to Tacitus and Suetonius, Claudius was killed by a plate of mushrooms, his favorite dish. His wife, Agrippina the Younger, allegedly orchestrated the poisoning to ensure her son Nero took the throne. Some say the poison was smeared on the mushroom caps. Others claim it was baked into a sauce. The emperor fell ill that night, vomiting and gasping. When the poison didn't act quickly enough, a physician loyal to Agrippina finished the job by placing a feather soaked in poison down Claudius's throat. Then there was King Charles II of Navarre, known as Charles the Bad. A cruel and cunning ruler, Charles was severely ill in 1387. His physician wrapped him in linen soaked in brandy, a treatment for fever. But when a servant attempted to cut away the cloth with a candle nearby, the alcohol ignited. Charles burned alive in his bed. While not poisoned by food, this moment is a grim reminder that sometimes the danger is not in the dish, but in the hands that serve it. In England, King John, infamous villain of Robin Hood tales, also met his end through a feast gone wrong. According to the 13th century chronicler Roger of Wendover, John consumed a surfeit of peaches and new ale and died shortly after. Some suspect it was dysentery. Others believe he was poisoned by a monk in revenge for seizing church lands. Either way, his gluttony gave way to death, from feast to funeral. One of the most documented poisonings in history occurred in the glittering courts of Renaissance Italy. Pope Clement VII, a Medici, dined at a banquet in 1534 and fell violently ill hours later. He survived for several days, suffering agony. Physicians reported signs consistent with arsenic or corrosive sublimate. The food, a fish stew, sent as a gift from a rival cardinal. In Russia, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, the son of Ivan the Terrible, was struck down not by food, but by his father's own hand. Yet many believe the spiral began with a bitter debate over a court banquet. Who was invited, who was served first? Pride turned to rage, and rage to murder. Again, the table, not the battlefield, became the place where dynasties fell. In France, Queen Jeanne of Navarre, wife of Philip IV, died suddenly in 1305. Chroniclers accused her rival, Mahaut d'Artois, of sending her a gift of perfumed gloves laced with poison. Jeanne reportedly fell ill after wearing them during a royal feast. Within days, she was dead. Whether the poison entered through her skin or food is debated, but the gloves, like a poisoned fork, became an invisible weapon of elegance. During the Borgia era in Italy, food became a political instrument of execution. The family was notorious for slipping poison into wine, figs, and pastries during amicable dinners. Cesare Borgia, at one point, was rumored to own a special ring containing a hidden pin for delivering small doses of venom into food. His father, Pope Alexander VI, died under mysterious circumstances after a meal. Some say he was poisoned by his own son, by accident. Even in more recent history, the danger lingered. In 1953, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, died after a dinner party with his inner circle. He collapsed alone, was left unattended for hours, and never regained consciousness. Officially, the cause was a stroke, but some speculate his wine was laced by Beria or another rival in the Politburo. After all, Stalin was known to switch dishes randomly, taste from others' plates, and rotate food staff constantly. In the end, it may not have saved him. And then, the 21st century. In 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, a former Russian spy, died in London after drinking tea laced with polonium-210, a rare and highly radioactive substance. Though not a royal, Litvinenko's death echoed centuries of history. A trusted drink, a shared table, a betrayal hidden in warmth. He lingered for weeks, his body decaying while he remained alive. His final photos shocked the world. But the truth was ancient. A single sip had sealed his fate. What unites these stories is not just death, but the illusion of safety. These men and women were not careless. They dined under guard, surrounded by protocol. Yet the danger always found its way in, wrapped in silk, stirred into stew, hidden in honey, because poison respects no crown. It cares not for dynasties or decrees. It flows where ambition guides it. And it waits patiently behind porcelain lids and silver spoons. So tonight, dear listener, as you lie in comfort, consider this. History was shaped not only by battles and edicts, but by dinners gone wrong, by one bite too many, by the wrong person preparing the right dish. Sleep now. The table is cleared, but the hunger for power is never satisfied. Long before modern laboratories and forensic toxicology, humanity faced an ancient, terrifying question. How do you know if your next bite will kill you? And so, across empires and centuries, kings, priests, physicians, and servants all developed ways, some brilliant, some absurd, to answer that question before it was too late. Tonight, we journey into the strange science and stranger superstition behind how the powerful tried to detect death in a dish. Let us begin with the most famous of tools, silver. For centuries, it was believed that silver, pure, untarnished, noble, had the ability to detect poison. If a silver spoon darkened or blackened when it touched food or drink, it was taken as a divine warning. Monarchs dined exclusively with silver utensils. Some even had entire serving sets made of silver alloy, believing it would sweat or blister in the presence of arsenic or cyanide. In reality, silver can indeed react with sulfur compounds, such as hydrogen sulfide, found in spoiled eggs or certain naturally occurring toxins. But it tells nothing about poisons like strychnine or belladonna. Still, belief outweighed science. In Versailles, during Louis XIV's reign, a tarnished spoon could halt an entire banquet. The meal would be thrown out, the cooks interrogated, and the king would dine on bread and salt. Then came the animals. From ancient China to the courts of Renaissance Italy, rulers employed living test subjects, dogs, birds, cats, and even monkeys, to sample food before it was served. These animals were chosen for their small size, fast metabolism, and visible reactions. If the bird died, the food was thrown out. If the dog convulsed, the chef was punished. In Russia, czars preferred ravens for meat and small terriers for drink. Some Ottoman records mention the use of tortoises, whose slow reactions were measured over hours. A dish would be fed to the animal early in the morning. If, by evening, it still roamed the palace garden, the food was deemed safe for the sultan the next day. But there were flaws. Animals don't react the same as humans. Some poisons take hours to manifest. Others are species-specific. A duck might survive what would kill a man. And so, human tasters remained, sometimes waiting beside the animal cages, eyes nervously tracking feathers and fur. Then there was taste itself. In the absence of lab tests, the tongue became the first defense. Trained tasters were taught to recognize specific sensations, bitter with numbness, possible belladonna, or atropine. Metallic sharpness may suggest arsenic or antimony. Slick, oily film, associated with hemlock or castor-derived toxins, but poisoners adapted. They used honey, spices, and milk to mask flavors. They diluted toxins into sauces or fermented them into syrups, and many lethal substances were tasteless, like cyanide or certain mushrooms. A skilled taster could do little more than pray. In India, the concept of visha, or poison, was both scientific and spiritual. Texts like the Sushruta Samhita outlined symptoms of various toxins. Color changes in the face, the feel of the pulse, the scent of breath. Physicians were taught to drop a morsel of food into a fire. If it hissed, smoked black, or smelled sour, it was deemed dangerous. Fire was judge and jury. Europe, during the late Middle Ages, added another bizarre layer, urine testing. Yes, certain royal physicians believed that a food's effect on the body could be detected by how it altered urine. If a servant ate a portion of the dish, then urinated into a bowl after an hour, the fluid's color, foam, and clarity were inspected. Pale with bubbles, safe. Dark with residue, suspect. Others preferred candle flame tests. A bit of food was held over a candle. If the flame flickered, turned blue, or emitted a strange odor, poison was suspected. Of course, many spices and fats behaved this way. But in a world of uncertainty, caution ruled over logic. The most bizarre of all may come from Renaissance Naples. The bezoar stone. Bezoars are calcified masses found in the stomachs of certain animals, particularly goats and deer. Thought to be magical, these stones were placed in goblets on plates or ground into powder. If the bezoar changed color or dissolved, it was believed that poison was present. So powerful was the legend that European royalty paid fortunes for. Bezoars from the East. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly kept one set in gold. French kings had theirs mounted in drinking cups. The bezoar trade was so lucrative that fake stones flooded markets made from clay and bone. Then there were poison-detecting rings, tiny tools worn by nobles or high priests, often with hollow chambers or testing surfaces. Some were dipped into wine and watched for reaction. Others were simply symbolic, a false sense of safety. In 17th century Persia, court physicians used alchemical reagents, powders of mercury or nitrate dropped into wine. If the liquid turned green or foamed, it was discarded. These early tests, while inconsistent, laid the groundwork for true chemistry. But perhaps the most effective tool was fear itself. The knowledge that food would be scrutinized, tasted, measured, and watched created a culture of caution. Cooks were sworn to silence. Ingredients were traced back to farms. In some courts, kitchens had no doors, only guarded entryways. And the consequences for mistakes? Lethal. In Japan, ninja clans who served as bodyguards developed their own tasting techniques. One involved biting food and holding it in the cheek for several minutes without swallowing. If numbness or burning began, they spit it out. Another trick was dipping a reed paper strip into broth and placing it on the tongue, a primitive litmus test. Over time, science improved. In the 18th and 19th centuries, methods like the Marsh test allowed for arsenic detection. Tasting gave way to burning, distilling, observing under magnifying lenses. But by then, the role of the food taster, the first detector, had already written its legacy. They were not chemists. They were not doctors. But their tongues, their instincts, and their pain formed the first defense between ruler and ruin. And they worked not in laboratories, but in silence. A look, a cough, a moment of hesitation. That was the signal. So tonight, dear listener, consider this. Long before we had test kits and microscopes, someone risked their life with every bite. Their body was the experiment, their fate, the result. Sleep now. The fire is low, the dish has cooled. But the question remains, would you take the first taste? In the golden-lit kitchens of palaces across the world, Two figures stood at the very edge of power, close enough to smell the king's breath, but far enough to be expendable. The royal cook, master of flavor and craft, and the royal taster, sentinel of the stomach. One created the meal, the other risked their life on it. To the outside world, they served the same purpose, to feed and protect. But behind the polished copper pans and embroidered aprons, their relationship simmered, with mistrust, resentment, and, sometimes, fear. Because when poison found its way into the palace, suspicion didn't fall on foreign enemies. It started in the kitchen. Let us begin in the Palace of Versailles, where meals were theater. Dozens of cooks, sous chefs, pastry masters, and bakers labored daily to create the king's feast. The taster, however, was not part of their brigade. He belonged to the royal household, not the kitchen staff. He did not report to the chef, but to the grand maître d'hôtel, a noble appointed to oversee royal meals. This separation ensured independence and bred tension. The taster inspected food after it left the kitchen. If he detected an off odor, a strange consistency, a suspicious ingredient, the dish was rejected. It was a direct insult to the aide-de-cook. Hours of labor discarded, recipes questioned, and if the taster fell ill, or worse, died, the cook's life hung in the balance. In one notorious case from 1711, a fish stew served to Louis XIV caused a taster to vomit violently. The dish had included a rare mushroom, recently imported. The cook claimed it was safe. The taster disagreed. The dish was discarded. Days later, the king praised the taster's caution. The cook was demoted. The mushroom was banned from royal menus. And for years afterward, no one dared innovate. Innovation was itself dangerous. Royal kitchens prized consistency. A dish done too well could be seen as suspicious. Why was it sweeter today? Why creamier? Had something been added? The taster, trained to detect difference, would raise the alarm. And the cook, proud, overworked, and constantly judged, would bristle. In imperial Russia, tensions could be fatal. During Catherine the Great's reign, a dessert called zephyr, a sweet meringue-like treat, caused a minor scandal. A new cook added an unfamiliar fruit essence. The taster flagged it as odd. The empress refused the dessert. The cook was flogged for reckless creativity. The next day, the taster discovered the same dessert on his own plate, sent by an anonymous kitchen boy. He never ate it. The dish was tested. It contained no poison, but the message was clear. Watch yourself. Sometimes cooks and tasters formed quiet alliances. They developed hand signals, eye contact cues, subtle ways to communicate what couldn't be said aloud. This batch was rushed. That wine bottle looked wrong. In the Ottoman court, it's said that a cook named Aziz once saved his taster by deliberately oversalting a suspicious lamb stew, forcing it to be rejected before tasting. The next day, a fellow steward confessed to having laced the dish with opium. But not all stories end with trust. In Ming Dynasty China, court records describe a tragic episode. A taster named Li Wei died after sampling a bowl of noodles laced with crushed foxglove. The cook, when confronted, claimed innocence. Investigators discovered the cook's assistant had received a bribe, but both the cook and the assistant were executed. Why? Because the emperor ruled, a dish is a chain. A break anywhere breaks the whole. This ruling haunted kitchens across Asia and Europe. Cooks learned to fear their tasters, not because they lied, but because they could doom them with a single word. A taster's complaint could mean lashes. A fainting spell could lead to a beheading. And a mistake? A death sentence for everyone involved. In some courts, the tension became institutionalized. In 18th century Persia, royal tasters were forbidden from speaking directly to cooks. All feedback passed through an intermediary, the inspector of taste, a minor court official who managed disputes. This buffer reduced friction and diluted responsibility. But distance did not equal safety. In the Mughal Empire, kitchens were divided by class and caste. Hindu chefs prepared vegetarian dishes. Muslim chefs handled meat. Tasters came from a different class entirely. This layered structure was meant to prevent collaboration and collusion. No single group could poison the emperor, but it also meant no group trusted the other. Meals became puzzles. No one knew who had done what, and when things went wrong, everyone pointed fingers. So why didn't they just work together? Because ambition is sharp. A cook who gained the king's favor might rise in rank, earn gold, even titles. A taster who caught a real poisoning could become a confidant. But in a world where praise was scarce and death always possible, glory for one often meant downfall for the other. Still, there were exceptions. In 19th century Japan, during the reign of Emperor Meiji, a legendary partnership was forged between the royal chef Haruki Masuda and the taster Kenta Arai. Haruki kept a private notebook where he logged every dish Kenta tested. If Kenta noted discomfort, even from spices or temperature, Haruki adjusted the recipe. Over years, their trust deepened. When a rice shipment arrived from an unfamiliar source, Kenta hesitated to taste it. Haruki destroyed the entire stock, claiming spoilage. Days later, the supplier was arrested for smuggling contaminated grains. The emperor never knew. But in Haruki's final journal, he wrote, "I served no master more loyally than the man who kept me honest." Their story is rare. More often, the cook and taster stood like flint and steel, close, essential, but always at risk of striking sparks. Because at court, the kitchen was not just a place of knives and fire. It was a battlefield, a stage, a confessional. And when something went wrong, it was not just food that got burned. So tonight, dear listener, picture a candlelit kitchen. A pot bubbles. A dish is plated. A cook wipes their brow. And behind them, in the doorway, a figure waits silently, ready to taste not just the food, but the truth. Sleep now. Tomorrow, another meal will be made, another judgment passed, and somewhere, another alliance tested. Imagine sitting down to eat your next meal, knowing it may be your last. Not because of illness, not because of war, but because your very job is to put your life between another person and a possible death. And that person, a king, an emperor, a dictator, may not even know your name. This is the psychology of the royal food taster. They have appeared in every era, from slaves in ancient Egypt to trained soldiers in modern intelligence services. Their role on paper is simple, but emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, it is anything but. Tonight, we do not walk through palaces or dusty archives. Tonight, we step into the mind of a person who eats for someone else and might never taste peace again. The first feeling is anticipation. It begins before the food arrives, the moment they wake up. Did someone tamper with the kitchens? Was there tension at court yesterday? Did a rival whisper to the chef? Every detail matters. A new cook, a delayed delivery, a missing ingredient. These are not trivial concerns, they are possible omens. And so the taster learns to notice everything. The tone of a steward, the way a knife rests on a tray, the color of wine in a glass. Anticipation becomes hyper-awareness. Every sense sharpens. Eyes scan movements. Ears register pauses. The body tenses, always just enough to move quickly, but never enough to seem afraid. Then comes doubt. The plate is placed before them. The food looks fine. It smells normal. The presentation is perfect, but that's the problem, isn't it? It's always perfect before it kills. They take the bite. Some tasters nibble, others chew fully. A few swallow immediately, defiant. But all are trained to note texture, flavor, reaction, not as chefs, but as detectors. Does the tongue tingle? Is there a strange numbness? A dryness in the throat? And then they wait. The clock becomes their tormentor. 10 seconds. Nothing. 30 seconds. Still fine. 1 minute. Is that a headache? No, it's just nerves. Or is it doubt creeps in? What if the poison is slow? What if the dosage is new? What if today is the day? Some tasters faint from panic alone. Others vomit out of pure psychosomatic response. And for those who survive, the doubt never leaves. After that comes detachment. You cannot eat for someone else and stay human forever. So they separate, not from the world, but from themselves. Many develop rituals. Prayers whispered into napkins. Lucky tokens hidden in sleeves. One Japanese taster in the 19th century reportedly hummed the same lullaby before every meal, not to calm himself, but to tell his wife, if he died, that he'd been thinking of her. Some tasters stop eating outside of work entirely. They lose joy in food. Everything becomes risk analysis. Is that bitterness real or imagined? One bite for pleasure becomes a professional hazard. Others embrace stoicism. They stop asking, why me, and start saying, it is what it is. They laugh more, joke more, cry less. One royal taster in Tudor England kept a journal. He never named names, but in it, he wrote, I no longer think of myself as a man. I am a bell. If I ring, the king does not eat. If I do not ring, the king lives. That is all I am. But not all is sorrow. There is also pride, because behind the fear is a strange sense of honor. To eat for another is to be trusted, to be relied upon, even if never thanked. Some tasters become fiercely protective of their monarchs, not out of loyalty to the crown, but to the person. They watch not just the food, but the people around them. They speak when others don't. They notice when moods change. In a way, they become the sovereign's final shield, and when the ruler survives, when the banquet ends and no one dies, they feel it. That quiet relief, that internal whisper, I did my job, again. One Ottoman taster, Hassan El Amini, was asked why he had continued the job for over 2 decades. His answer was simple, because no one remembers the cook when the Sultan lives, but if he dies, I am the only name in the fire. That awareness drives many tasters to perfection. They train themselves to spot subtle flavors, to know the difference between vinegar and arsenic, to predict how someone might try to hide death in a crust or a broth, and in doing so, they become more than tasters. They become guardians of rhythm, of repetition, of survival. But then there's the part no one talks about. The isolation. Because how do you live a normal life? When your job is to almost die, can you tell your spouse, your children? Do they sleep easy, knowing each day you might not return from the dining hall? Can you eat at home without panic? Can you trust a restaurant? Can you enjoy a picnic? Many food tasters retreat from the world. They live in servant quarters. They walk alone. They do not form close friendships, not because they don't want to, but because people leave them. The shadow of death lingers on their clothes. Some drink too much. Others pray obsessively. A few go mad. But most endure, because someone must. And then there are those rare ones. The few who grow old in the job, who retire quietly, with nothing more than a medal and a nod. They never write memoirs. They never seek the spotlight, because they understand something most people never do. Their entire existence was lived in service of another's heartbeat, and that kind of life, though often silent, is perhaps the most profound of all. So tonight, dear listener, close your eyes and imagine this. A man sits before a dish. He lifts his fork. The room is silent. The king watches. The court holds its breath. He takes a bite and waits. And somewhere deep inside, he smiles. Because for one more night, someone else will live, thanks to his courage. Sleep now. The plate is empty, but the echo of that quiet, noble act still lingers. They tasted first, but the king died anyway. For all the rituals, the silken gloves, the triple-sealed trays and trusted tasters, history is full of moments when poison slipped through, silent, clever, fatal. And it is in those moments, when the last shield failed, that we remember the food taster not as a protector, but as a witness, or worse, a pawn. In the grand banquet halls of Rome, one emperor did everything right. Claudius, cautious, scholarly, paranoid, surrounded himself with food tasters, chemists, and superstitious rituals. Every dish passed multiple layers of testing, but it was all undone by a single mushroom, or more precisely, a plate of them. It was said to be his favorite dish, sent by his wife, Agrippina. The tasters tried it first. No ill effects. But what they didn't know was that the mushrooms were divided, one portion harmless, the other laced with slow-acting toxins. Claudius received the poisoned half. And when the poison didn't act fast enough, a doctor loyal to Agrippina administered the finishing dose, hidden in a feather placed against the back of his throat. No protocol failed. No taster betrayed him. But the system was outmaneuvered, not by the cook, but by a queen. In Russia, Tsar Paul the Fair of the Romanov dynasty feared plots more than war. He rotated his kitchen staff weekly, had meals tasted, and never drank from the same goblet twice. Yet shortly before his assassination in 1801, Paul became violently ill after a simple dinner. His taster had sampled the stew and wine, both declared safe. But later investigations suggested the poison wasn't in the food, but on the rim of the cup. A servant, bribed or blackmailed, had coated the inside edge with a slow-acting narcotic. The taster drank from a ladle. The Tsar drank from the cup. Paul recovered from that incident, but not for long. A week later, he was murdered in his bedroom, officially a coup. But the first attempt had been more elegant, more discreet. In Sweden, King Gustav III hosted lavish masquerade balls and ruled with a theatrical flair. He was well aware of the risks of food and trusted his taster implicitly. One day, a chilled compote of layered berries was served. The taster sampled from the top. The king ate from the bottom. Hours later, the king collapsed. The poison had settled in the syrup, denser than the fruit, resting unseen at the base. The taster lived. The king didn't. In his final days, Gustav was unable to speak. His eyes, it said, fixed often on the kitchen door, as if wondering how it had all gone wrong. In Florence, during the Renaissance, the Medici were patrons of art, science, and, quietly, poison. Francesco I de' Medici and his wife, Bianca Capello, died within hours of each other in 1587. The cause was officially malaria, but modern forensic analysis of their remains showed high levels of arsenic in their bones. The couple had eaten together that evening. The food had been tasted, yet both died. The likely culprit was not the meal itself, but the wine that accompanied it. The wine had not been part of the tasting protocol. A small private reserve opened only once it reached their table. A luxury and a loophole. History doesn't always record who poured it, but the silence that followed was louder than any accusation. Some poisonings unfolded slowly, almost invisibly. In the Mughal Empire, Emperor Jahangir was known for his fondness for opium and wine. His food taster, a trusted servant named Aslam, had served for years without incident. Then the emperor began falling ill. His mood changed. His strength waned. Only after months of decline did physicians suspect cumulative poisoning. The wine had been fine, the food tested clean, but Aslam, it turned out, had been introducing microdoses, sublethal amounts of toxin over weeks. Enough to confuse, enough to weaken. And by the time he was caught, Jahangir could barely stand. He survived. Aslam didn't. Even in the 20th century, with science and medicine at humanity's fingertips, the pattern repeated. In 1945, Emperor Hirohito of Japan was protected by a team of young women assigned to taste his food during wartime shortages. One of them, Sato Shigeko, recalled a friend who fell ill after sampling a rice roll. The dish had been approved. The emperor later consumed it and became violently sick. It wasn't sabotage from a foreign agent. It was a toxin from a contaminated local plant, misidentified by desperate cooks trying to stretch supplies. The taste was masked. The taster had only a few bites. The emperor finished the rest. He survived. The girl didn't. No scandal followed. No memorial was raised. Sometimes the taster was the traitor. In the court of Louis XIII of France, a trusted taster named Pierre Leclerc had grown resentful. He'd served without promotion for years. His complaints were ignored, so he made a plan, not to kill, but to shake. He began altering reports, flagging safe dishes as suspicious, approving unsafe combinations, stirring doubt into every meal. One day, a stew he'd certified caused the king days of illness. Investigations revealed Pierre had eaten from a different pot, a near miss. He was arrested. His defense? I did my job. I tasted. I lived. The court ruled. Then the system failed. And with it, the king's trust in everything around him. These stories share something deeper than tragedy. They reveal that no matter how precise the tasting ritual, how loyal the personnel, how trained the eye and tongue, the world around the taster could always shift. A cook might be compromised, a cup might be swapped, a hand might hesitate at the wrong moment, because, in the end, poison doesn't need permission, it doesn't knock. It simply waits, in the air, in the wine, at the bottom of a bowl, and when it strikes, the taster becomes irrelevant. So tonight, dear listener, sleep gently. But remember, not every death at the table came from a missing taster. Some came because the taster did their job, and fate simply chose not to listen. There are rules, and then there are the rules beneath them. For food tasters, those silent guardians of royal meals, the official protocols were always present. Taste the dish, watch for symptoms, report concerns. But beneath the surface lay an older code, one not found in training manuals or court decrees, one passed from taster to taster in whispers, in looks, in stories shared behind closed kitchens. They were the unwritten rules, the rules that kept them alive. And tonight, for the first time, we speak them aloud. Rule 1. Never taste when hungry. It seems harmless enough. But hunger dulls perception. A starving man won't notice bitterness, won't pause at an unusual spice. He'll swallow too fast, miss the warning signs. And in this job, your first instinct is your last defense. That's why tasters often ate. A small meal before duty, bland rice, boiled vegetables, bread dipped in broth. Just enough to keep the senses sharp. Never too much. Just enough, because a full stomach sees better than an empty one. Rule 2. Watch the hands, not the food. The danger rarely sits on the plate. It's in the way a wine bearer grips the goblet, in how a steward hesitates when listing ingredients, in the twitch of a chef's eye when the taster lifts their fork. Tasters are not just eaters, they're observers. They scan the room, not the dish. They read people like pages, looking for fear, guilt, calculation. The food may be clean. The cook may not be. And if something feels off, refuse, even if it costs you your post, because better a dismissed taster than a dead monarch. Rule 3. Taste from the center. Many poisons are heavier than broth, oil, or milk. They settle at the bottom, or they're smeared along the edge of a bowl. A careless taster might sip the yaw. Top, taste nothing, and approve a deadly serving. The veterans know better. They stir the food gently. Taste from the deepest point. If it's a roll, they slice it. If it's a fig, they chew slowly, watching for numbness on the tongue. The poisoner is clever. The taster must be wiser. Rule 4. Trust no sequence. You tasted the bread. You felt fine, but the second course still waits. One of the deadliest assumptions is that if the first bite is safe, the rest will be too. But poisoners know timing. They know expectations. They put the toxin in the final sip of soup, the fourth slice of pear, the sauce that arrives late, fresh from the pot. Tasters know. Every course is a new threat. Never let your guard down. Not for dessert, not for tea, not even for the water. Rule 5. You are alone. This is the cruelest truth of all. No one will save you. Not the steward beside you. Not the guard at the door. Not the king you serve. If you fall, your job is to fall fast. So the monarch won't. You cannot hesitate. You cannot cry out dramatically. You cannot clutch your stomach and gasp. That's theater. That wastes seconds. You eat. You feel it. You react. And if you live, you stay quiet. Because surviving your job is not permission to speak. It's permission to return to the table tomorrow. Rule 6. Never take compliments. It may sound strange, but praise is dangerous in this profession. If a cook thanks you for your trust, it may mean they're testing your boundaries. If a courtier praises your courage, they may be softening you up. If the monarch says, "You're the best I've ever had," you're already being watched. Tasters live in the shadows. Visibility breeds envy, and envy in a palace is poison of its own kind. Accept no gifts. Take no special meals. Share no secrets. Your value is in your silence, not your recognition. Rule 7. Taste for the person, not the title. This rule is whispered only between veterans, because a good taster serves the throne, but a great one serves the soul behind it. Monarchs are not machines. They are men and women, scared, lonely, often surrounded by flatterers and traitors alike. A true taster watches their eyes, notes their appetite, learns their habits. They protect not just from poison, but from overindulgence, depression, anxiety. They know when to recommend tea over wine, broth over meat, silence over conversation. They don't just save the body, they steady the mind. And sometimes, that's the difference between reign and ruin. Rule 8. Leave no favorites. A taster cannot afford attachments. To cooks, to staff, to certain dishes. The moment you want something, you can be manipulated. The moment you like someone, you can be blinded. Eat what is given. Reject only what must be rejected. Build no habits. Forge no alliances. Stay neutral. Stay empty, because every person at court has a motive, and the taster's only motive must be survive, protect, disappear. Rule 9. Keep a second stomach. Not a literal one, but a private memory. Many tasters keep personal notes, hidden scrolls, coded ledgers. Not for the court, for themselves. They record what they tasted, how they felt, who served the dish, what the room smelled like. Why? Because if they fall ill hours later, they need to remember. Because if a pattern begins to emerge, they must be the first to see it. The official kitchen logs are for appearances. The private ones? For truth. Rule 10. Never outlive a poisoned king. This one is almost never spoken aloud, because when the monarch dies of poison, the taster's fate is already sealed. Maybe they were bribed. Maybe they were careless. Maybe they did everything right and still failed. It doesn't matter. Someone must be blamed. Someone must pay. and the one who tasted and lived? They are the most suspect of all. So if the king falls, the taster rarely survives, not because they're guilty, but because trust dies with the crown. These rules aren't written, but every real taster learns them, not from scrolls or training, manuals, but from scars, from close calls, from the quiet fear behind every bite, and they obey them. Not because they want to, but because in a profession where one mistake means death, the unwritten rules matter more than the written ones ever could. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think of them. The nameless ones who eat with no hunger, speak with no voice, and live with no legacy. They followed the rules, and for another day, the king lived. He wakes before the candles are lit, not because someone called him, but because he never truly sleeps. His bed is within the eastern servant wing of Versailles, a small, sparse chamber with stone floors and a single window facing the palace kitchens. There is no clock, only the memory of footsteps. He counts them in his head, marks the hour by the patterns of other men's routines. He is a goûteur du roi, a food taster to His Majesty Louis XIV, the Sun King. And today, like every day, his first thought is not about breakfast, but survival. By the time the first carts of ingredients arrive, he is already dressed. Dark trousers, stiff collar, hands clean. He does not smile. Smiling in his role is dangerous. It makes people believe you're comfortable. And comfortable, men make mistakes. He does not step into the kitchen. That's forbidden. His presence must remain separate, neutral. But he waits nearby, watches the faces of the kitchen boys, the head chef, the wine carrier. He notes who is new, who looks tired, who is missing. Not because he's nosy, because he has to. The king will dine at noon. Before that, the menu is decided by the maître d'hôtel and approved by the royal physician. Today's courses, a veal consommé, a plate of artichokes in butter, pigeon pie, and apricot tarts. It all sounds exquisite. It also sounds dangerous. At 10:15, a sealed tray arrives at the Salon de Dégustation, a private chamber where the taster begins his work. 2 guards accompany it. A priest stands in the corner pretending to observe for piety's sake. In truth, he's watching for treason. The taster begins with the consommé. He does not sip it delicately. He stirs it twice, clockwise, and dips a silver spoon to the center of the bowl. Silver is said to tarnish in the presence of poison, but he doesn't trust that. Silver can't smell. Silver doesn't panic. He can. The broth tastes clean. Salty? Too salty? He waits. 30 seconds, breathes, swallows, waits again. Next, the artichokes. Butter is an easy carrier for toxins. Rich, oily. It hides things. He tastes, notes the texture, listens to his body. No tingle in the gums, no tightness in the chest. Still, he doesn't exhale. Now, the pie. This is the hardest. Pigeon meat spoils fast. The crust can cover anything. He cuts through the center, tastes from the bottom, chews slowly. He feels something hard. A bone? No, a peppercorn. Still he pauses. He's trained to detect the tiniest of irregularities. Not just taste, heat, texture, moisture, instinct. His mouth is a battlefield. The tart is last. Sweets are rarely poisoned. Too ceremonial, too watched. But not always. He slices a corner. Tastes and waits. 15 minutes pass. Then 30. No symptoms. He nods to the guards. The tray is resealed, sent to the royal table. His work is done. But his fear is not. He does not eat lunch. He never does. Appetite has long since left him. Instead, he walks the corridor near the throne room, watches the faces of nobles entering the grand hall, notes who brings gifts, who speaks to the maître d'hôtel, who offers wine. The king eats. The taster watches. Sometimes Louis gestures to him from across the room, a nod of appreciation. He returns it politely, but not too warmly. If he gets too close, it makes others nervous. If he stays too distant, the king may think him aloof. It's a dance. He has learned never to linger. In the afternoon, he reports to the chamberlain, offering a list of dishes served, his reactions, the names of those involved. Every detail matters. He mentions the oversalted consommé. The priest made a note of it, too. By 4 p.m., he is sent back to his quarters. He removes his uniform, washes his hands again, sleeps if he can. At 7 p.m., another tray arrives. This time, a light dinner for the king. A soft cheese, bread, olives, and wine. Wine is the worst. You can't taste poison in it, especially if the wine is already bitter, strong, or spiced. Some days, he's given 2 bottles, one to taste, one to serve. But he's seen bottles swapped at the last second. So tonight, he insists. Open the bottle in front of me. Bavary. Steward hesitates. That alone is reason enough to stop the entire service. The bottle is opened, poured into a glass. He watches the color, swirls it, smells, sips, waits, nothing. But still the doubt lingers. When the king retires to his chambers, the taster does not sleep. He sits, listens, prays. He does not dream. Dreaming for him is dangerous. It means the body has relaxed, and he cannot afford that. He once tried to keep a journal, but after 3 pages he burned it, because even writing down his thoughts felt like tempting fate. He has no friends. The kitchen staff avoids him. Other servants call him Ghost Tongue. Some envy him for his access, his proximity to the king. Others pity him. No one truly speaks to him. He is always alone. And yet, every evening, when the sun sets behind the gilded rooftops of Versailles and no bells toll in morning, and the king lives, he smiles, not because he feels joy, but because for one more day, his fear kept the throne safe. So tonight, dear listener, remember this. While courtiers plot and kings rule and kitchens steam with spices and fire, there is always one man, nameless, sleepless, tasting not for hunger, but for honor. A man who never finishes a meal, because to him a clean plate means the job is done, and he lived long enough to do it again. Sleep now. The palace is quiet. The dishes are clean. But behind, a heavy door. Someone still sits, listening, waiting, watching, just in case tomorrow is the day he doesn't wake up. Not all poisons scream, some whisper, some wait. And the deadliest of all, they taste like nothing at all. Throughout history, the art of killing has rarely been more refined than in the realm of food. From palaces to prisons, poison has been the weapon of the patient, those who couldn't strike with a blade, but who could serve a cup of wine. And tonight, we lift the lid on the most dangerous ingredients ever stirred into royal recipes. And why no taster, no matter how skilled, could always stop them. Let's begin with one of the oldest and most trusted killers, arsenic. Known since ancient times as the inheritance powder, arsenic is nearly tasteless, odorless, and can be mixed into just about anything: stews, pastries, even water. In small doses, it causes nausea, fatigue, and confusion. In large ones, it kills. The Medici used it, so did Borgia popes. In 19th century France, it was sold openly in apothecaries, under the name poudre de succession, literally, succession powder. Its effects mimicked natural illness, and without modern blood tests, even the most observant taster would never suspect it. A slice of cake, a bowl of soup, one too many almonds, and the damage was done, not immediately, but hours later. By the time symptoms appeared, the king had already eaten. The taster might have survived, but the monarch wouldn't. Then came cyanide. Derived from bitter almonds and certain seeds, Cyanide was known to ancient Persians and later refined by chemists. In the 18th and 19th centuries, unlike arsenic, cyanide works fast, sometimes within seconds, but it has a faint scent. Bitter almonds. That should help, right? Not always. A significant portion of the population, nearly 40%, cannot detect that smell due to a genetic variation. So if your taster was one of them, the poison would pass unnoticed. Even worse, cyanide vaporizes easily in hot food, making it ideal for warm broths or sauces. There was once a royal soup prepared for a French duke, which reportedly smelled earthy to the taster. He passed it anyway. The duke collapsed 15 minutes later. By the time they suspected cyanide, the ladle had already been cleaned. Another silent killer was belladonna, or deadly nightshade, used by assassins in ancient Rome and Renaissance. Italy, it causes hallucinations, disorientation, and eventual organ failure. But it doesn't always taste bitter. In fact, its active compounds, atropine and scopolamine, can be dissolved into wine, tea, or even honey without altering the flavor significantly. One notorious case involved a poisoned fig, gifted to a rival during a banquet. The fruit was soaked in belladonna overnight, then rinsed in sugar water to mask the bitterness. The taster sampled a different fig from the same bowl. The victim wasn't so lucky. Then there's aconite, also known as wolf's bane. This one does taste bitter, incredibly bitter. But when mixed into strong wine or heavily spiced food, the bitterness can be masked. Aconite causes burning in the mouth and throat, followed by numbness, slowed heart rate, and eventually paralysis. It was a favorite among certain Chinese dynasties, particularly in rivalries where death needed to look like disease. Some cooks learned to boil it with citrus, diluting the bitterness. Others used it to coat serving utensils, not the food itself. A knife dipped in aconite, a spoon rubbed in oil laced with it. When a dish was cut or stirred, the toxin transferred. And the taster? They used a different set. But perhaps the most horrifying poison was ricin, derived from castor beans. Unlike the others, ricin is virtually undetectable. No taste, no smell, no immediate reaction. Just devastation. Even a few micrograms can kill. There's no antidote, and symptoms don't appear until several hours after ingestion. By then, it's too late. Ricin was not widely known until modern times, but recent evidence suggests that its natural form, in improperly treated castor oil, may have played a role in several unexplained deaths throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. A taster would feel fine. The royal might too, for a few hours. Then the organ failure began. Even the cleverest could not defend against delayed toxins. In India, some assassins used a mixture of powdered opium, snake venom, and crushed datura, seeds, added not to the food itself, but to dessert wine. It took 6 hours to act. The taster, who had eaten earlier courses, was no longer on duty when the poison began its work. One of the most insidious strategies was temperature poisoning, using a toxin that only activated under heat or cold. A dish served cold to the taster, warmed for the king. The same meal, different reactions. In Ottoman courts, one poisoner laced a meat pastry with a substance that melted at 40 degrees Celsius, safe at room temperature, lethal once reheated. The taster approved it. The emperor ate it hot. He died before the second course. There were also layered poisons, dishes prepared in multiple parts, only one of which was contaminated. A taster might sample from the crust. The monarch from the filling, or poison, smeared on the underside of a pastry, unseen, untouched by the tester, or even in some cases the plate itself. Yes, certain ceramics were coated with toxic glazes. A bit of acid, say lemon juice or wine, could leach the toxins into the food. The dish was clean, the ingredients were safe, but the serving vessel killed. Tasters had no way to detect that. They couldn't taste the plate. In some cultures, poisoned salt was used, mixed evenly into seasoning blends, used across multiple dishes. But the taster's portion was deliberately kept separate, unsalted. Only the king's plate received the final dusting, and when he died, it looked like heart failure. The taster lived and was executed. Sometimes the system wasn't bypassed. Sometimes it was betrayed. There are records of tasters being bribed, blackmailed, or promised promotion. All they had to do was nod, or taste from the wrong portion, or say nothing when their stomach burned. And so, even when poison was detectable, it wasn't stopped, because fear makes liars, and lies make graves. So tonight, dear listener, when you think of poison, do not picture bubbling potions or green liquid in goblets. Picture a cold fig soaked in silence. Picture a knife warm with betrayal. Picture a bowl of soup and a spoon made of secrets. Because the deadliest ingredients in history weren't always what went into the food. Sometimes the poison was where it was hidden. And the taster? Sometimes he never had a chance. They no longer wear embroidered tunics or carry silver spoons. They don't walk candlelit halls or bow to monarchs beneath golden ceilings. But they still exist. Today, they operate behind security perimeters, inside embassies, aboard aircraft, and within five-star kitchens. You won't see them in press briefings. They don't appear in photographs. But make no mistake, modern food tasters are real, and they still stand between the powerful and their plates. Their methods have changed, their uniforms, their tools, their status. But the fear that created them, that hasn't gone anywhere. Let's begin in the 20th century with the most infamous case of all, Adolf Hitler. In the final years of World War II, as paranoia consumed the Nazi high command, Hitler developed an obsession with being poisoned, even by his own staff. To counter the risk, he employed a team of 15 women tasked with tasting every meal served to him at the Wolf's Lair, his military headquarters in Eastern Europe. They weren't volunteers. Most were selected from nearby villages, young, healthy, and expendable. One of the few survivors, Margot Wulk, later recounted how each day the women would be locked in a small room. Meals were brought in. They ate meatless, vegetarian dishes prepared in silence. Then they waited. No one ever joined them. No one ever ate with them. They were just bodies, human canaries in the coal mine of Hitler's growing madness. Sometimes, she said, they cried while chewing. When the war neared its end and the Russians approached, Margot fled. The other tasters were never seen again. Their story disappeared for decades, but it didn't end there. In the 21st century, leaders of democratic nations are no less cautious. They're just quieter about it. The President of the United States, for example, travels with an elite culinary detail. Every meal is prepared under the watch of the Secret Service, who not only control access to ingredients and staff, but often oversee the entire kitchen. But here's what most people don't know. There's still a designated individual, not officially, called a taster, who samples the food before it reaches the president's plate. When President Obama visited France in 2013, local press noticed something odd. He declined a lavish banquet, not for dietary reasons, but because the White House had not approved the meal's preparation protocol. The French were insulted. The American delegation was unapologetic. Because protocol trumps politeness. Presidential. Food security is governed by a simple rule. If it can't be verified, it won't be eaten. That's why, during state visits, the president often eats food brought in by U.S. personnel prepared in controlled kitchens, with tasters and chemists nearby. In short, the system of tasting still exists. It just wears a suit now. In Russia, the practice is more rigid and more feared. Vladimir Putin, like many autocrats before him, reportedly maintains multiple food tasters, all part of the Presidential Security Service. Meals are often cooked in 3 separate kitchens. Ingredients are monitored from source to plate. Dishes are swapped randomly before serving to avoid pattern tracking. And yes, there are those who taste from each platter before it's placed before him. No photos, no names. But according to defectors, Putin has never eaten a meal that wasn't pre-screened by at least 3 individuals. That's not caution. That's routine. In North Korea, secrecy goes even deeper. Kim Jong-un's food tasting protocol is state classified. But interviews with defectors, chefs, and former guards reveal that the supreme leader eats only from dishes prepared in triplicate, in rotation across multiple kitchens. Tasters exist, sometimes chefs, sometimes bodyguards, and all are watched themselves. One misstep, one symptom, one doubt, they disappear. Some North Korean tasters last months, few last years, even in royal families. The tradition quietly endures. The British monarchy, for example, does not officially employ food tasters, but all meals are prepared under strict guidelines. Ingredients are sourced from vetted suppliers. Dishes are plated in sight of security. During major events, coronations, banquets, state receptions, certain staff sample food beforehand, though not under the label of taster. When Queen Elizabeth II visited the Middle East in 1979, palace aides insisted on serving her only food transported from London, with royal household staff present in the kitchen. Some called it rude. It was survival. But here's the haunting truth of modern food tasting. The threat has evolved. No longer is it just powdered arsenic or bitter roots. Today's assassins may use synthetic neurotoxins like VX or Novichok absorbed through touch or breath, bioengineered bacteria grown to mimic foodborne illness but weaponized to be incurable, delayed release capsules slipped into food, and activated by body temperature. And because modern food can be frozen, shipped, or altered chemically, tasters face new risks: unpredictable delay, deniable origin, invisible symptoms. That's why even modern tasters, soldiers, scientists, agents, are often surprised by what slips through. In 2004, Ukrainian presidential candidate Viktor Yushchenko was poisoned with dioxin, a toxic chemical that doesn't act immediately. He fell ill over days. No one noticed at first. No taster caught it. By the time the diagnosis came, his face was scarred for life. The food had passed inspection, but the poison had no smell, no taste, no mercy. So who are the tasters now? Some are chefs, some are agents, some are people whose names will never be known. They work not for glory, not for fame, but because someone must eat first. And still, today, in 2025, someone always does. So tonight, dear listener, as you sit in comfort, imagine a quiet room behind the stage. A man in uniform lifts a fork. He chews. He nods. And only then, does a president, a monarch, or a tyrant begin to eat. The world has changed, but the fear hasn't. And the ones who guard the table, they still taste in shadows. It's said that we die as we lived, but sometimes we die as we dined. Across history, there have been final meals, some grand, some humble, that marked the end not just of a life, but of a legacy. These were not accidental bites, nor quiet partings. These were orchestrated finales. Moments when food was more than nourishment. It was judgment. It was revenge. It was theater. And sometimes, it was war. Let us begin with Napoleon Bonaparte. Exiled to the island of St. Helena. After his final defeat, Napoleon lived under British supervision. His health declined. He complained of stomach pain, fatigue, and nausea. In 1821, after eating a simple lunch of liver, vegetables, and wine, he collapsed. Autopsies suggested stomach cancer, but suspicions swirled, and still do. Later forensic Analysis of hair samples revealed elevated arsenic levels, consistent with slow, repeated poisoning. Some believe the British wanted him gone. Others think a fellow exile, loyal to an older vision of France, carried it out. His last meal was not a grand feast. It was routine, deliberate, possibly fatal, because sometimes the most dangerous dinner is the one that seems harmless. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar dined with friends and senators the night before the Ides of March. He was warned not to attend the Senate meeting. He was told the omens were wrong. But at dinner, he was calm, confident. He drank wine. He ate roasted lamb. He quoted poetry. His food was not poisoned, but the meal itself was part of the setup, a last reassurance before the knives. The next day, as Caesar entered the Senate, those same dinner guests greeted him warmly, then stabbed him 23 times. The food didn't kill him, but it lulled him, and in that lull, betrayal sharpened. In 1793, Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, was sentenced to death by guillotine. The night before her execution, she was offered a final meal: broth, bread, and wine. She barely touched it, not because of pride, but because she knew. Nothing would taste right when your name is already written on the blade. But earlier that week, when hope remained, she had eaten a small almond cake sent by an unknown admirer. Hours later, she vomited violently. Some claimed it was nerves. Others said it was a failed rescue attempt, gone wrong. The cake may have contained a drug meant to make her appear ill, to delay execution. But the dosage was off. It was her last taste of sweetness. In the Soviet Union, Lavrenti Beria, head of Stalin's secret police, had ordered the deaths of thousands. He signed lists, chose victims, hosted parties, and then the day came when he fell from favor. He was arrested in 1953, shortly after Stalin's death. Before his trial, he was held under heavy guard. One day, a guard brought him a warm bowl of borscht and black bread, his favorite. He ate. Then after the meal, he was beaten, gagged, and executed without trial. Was the food poisoned? No. But it was symbolic, a final gesture of normalcy. Before a life built on terror ended without ceremony. Then there's Rasputin. The Russian mystic, healer, and royal confidant was despised by nobles. In 1916, they plotted to kill him and planned to do it with style. At a dinner in the home of Prince Yusupov, Rasputin was served pastries and wine laced with cyanide. He ate, he drank, and he did not die. In a panic, they shot him. Still, he stood. They stabbed him. He kept fighting. Finally, after being shot again and thrown into a frozen river, he drowned. His last meal was meant to be his execution. Instead, it became a tale of how hard it is to kill a legend, even with poison in the pudding. In modern times, final meals remain ritual, especially for those on death row. In the United States, condemned prisoners are granted a last meal of their choosing. Some request extravagance. Others ask for childhood comforts. A few refuse to eat at all. But in 2011, Texas ended the practice after one inmate, Lawrence Russell Brewer, ordered a massive meal: 2 chicken fried steaks, a triple bacon cheeseburger, fried okra, a pound of barbecued meat, 3 fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, ice cream, peanut butter fudge, and a root beer. Then he refused to touch any of it. The gesture was clear: you cannot control how I die. The state was furious. From that day forward, last meals in Texas were standardized. The tradition, centuries old, was ended by one man's defiance. And yet, not all last meals are grim. Some are beautiful. In 1997, Mother Teresa, frail and nearing death, ate a single piece of toast and drank tea with her caregiver. She held her cup with trembling hands, smiled, said nothing. Later that night, she passed in her sleep. No poison, no betrayal, just quiet and peace and warmth. Her last meal was not a weapon. It was a farewell. But the most chilling last meal is often the one where the diner doesn't know it's their last. The cup of coffee before the betrayal, the bowl of soup before the coup, the breakfast tray in a palace where someone is already sharpening a pen, or a knife. Because food doesn't always kill. Sometimes it just sets the stage. So tonight, dear listener, close your eyes and imagine the final meal you would choose if you could. Would it be something sweet? Something from childhood? Or would you refuse? Because for some, the last taste is not about flavor, it's about dignity, and in that bite, they reclaim it. Sleep now. The table is cleared, the room is quiet, but the last course always leaves an echo. They don't wear hoods, they don't laugh maniacally, they don't slip powders into goblets in the dark. Real poisoners don't look like villains, they look like stewards, chefs, courtiers, sometimes lovers, and they wait for days, for weeks, sometimes for years, because poisoning isn't just an act, it's a craft, a performance in silence. And tonight, we open the pages of their unspoken playbook. First rule, never aim for the food, aim for the system. Palace kitchens are built like fortresses. Ingredients are tracked, dishes are watched, tasters stand guard, but no system is perfect. So the poisoner doesn't go through the front door. They look for gaps. A changing of the kitchen staff, a new foreign gift, jams, spices, wines, a sick taster, replaced at the last minute. A moment of distraction during a festival, when routine is broken and everyone is tired. That's when the poisoner moves, not with violence, with a whisper, a bribe, a favor, sometimes just with silence. Second rule, let someone else deliver it. The most successful poisoners never touch the food. They use intermediaries, a cook's apprentice who unknowingly adds the wrong spice, a maid who sets the tray but doesn't know the plate was switched, a wine steward who pours from a different bottle, not knowing it was swapped that morning. The poisoner stays far from the act. They wash their hands, smile at the feast, and toast the monarch's health. Because when the death comes, they're already in another room. Third rule, choose the poison that suits the story. Killing a king with a foaming mouth and violent convulsions, that's not poison. That's a declaration of war. The real poisoner chooses subtler tools, something that mimics fever, something that takes time, so the blame becomes blurred, something that mimics a pre-existing illness, a known weakness, or old age itself. A little arsenic over weeks, a little belladonna that mimics indigestion, a little mercury to erode the mind. They don't want panic. They want a shrug, a sigh. How unfortunate, they'll say, and then they'll eat from the same dish and survive. Because they planned that too. Fourth rule, taste it yourself. It may seem counterintuitive, but many poisoners test the dose on themselves, not to die. Just to understand, a sip of wine, a crumb of pastry, a fingertip dipped in soup. They need to know how it feels, how fast it works, what signs it gives, and how long they can act before symptoms appear. Because timing is everything. A poison that kills in 5 minutes is a disaster. One that kills in 5 hours? That's an alibi. One that kills in 5 days? That's a new monarch. Fifth rule, poison the moment, not the meal. The food is just the carrier. The real target is trust. A king who survives an attempt won't sleep again. A courtier who suspects foul play will hesitate to sign the next treaty. A queen who sees her rival collapse after tea won't sip from any cup again. Sometimes the goal isn't death. Sometimes it's paranoia, and paranoia is the best poison of all because it never leaves. Sixth rule, never poison the same way twice. History watches. If a king dies after mushroom stew, no one eats mushrooms again. If wine becomes suspect, every bottle gets sniffed. The poisoner adapts. learns. They switch from solids to liquids, from herbs to minerals, from lunch to supper, from the first course to the napkin. Yes, even napkins have been laced, with powders absorbed through lips, with oils pressed into fingertips. Everything is a delivery method. Everything is a stage. Seventh rule: disappear before the applause. A successful poisoning changes the world. A new ruler rises, a policy shifts, a nation sighs. But the poisoner? They fade. They ask for no reward. They claim no credit. They let others grieve, rage, or rejoice, because power gained visibly is power that gets challenged. But power gained silently. It lasts. Some of history's greatest poisoners were never caught. Some were never even suspected. They changed dynasties, ended wars, started new ones, and they did it with a spoon. There is a rumor, quiet and persistent, that one royal poisoner in the court of the Abbasid Caliphate never once touched food. Instead, she handled perfume bottles, she worked in the harem, dressed the women, spritzed their wrists, advised on fashion, but her scents were laced with musk and a little more. Within months, 2 rival concubines fell ill. One died. The poison had entered through the skin. The caliph never suspected her. She died of old age. Another tale tells of a Japanese courtier who wrote poems for the emperor. He prepared ink, parchment, and brush. One night, the emperor invited him to dine in gratitude. The poet declined, claiming a stomach ache. The next day, the emperor fell dead. The ink on the invitation card had been soaked in a refined neurotoxin, absorbed through the fingertips. No one thought to suspect paper. The poet wrote one final verse that week, then vanished. These stories, real or embellished, remind us poisoners are not chaotic. They are not wild. They are careful. They are precise. They understand people, their habits, weaknesses, fears, and they know. Once you eat from a plate that someone else has touched, you've already surrendered control. So tonight, dear listener, while you lie in comfort, let your mind wander not to battles or kings or castles, but to a small room, a folded cloth, a drop of oil, a sip of wine that tasted perfectly fine, and a smile, far away, from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Sleep now. The game has already been played. You just never saw the board. It always begins the same way: a plate, a bowl, a cup of something warm, and somewhere nearby, someone is watching. Throughout history, food has meant more than hunger. It's been a ceremony, a trap, a gesture of peace, and a declaration of war. From golden thrones to tin spoons, the act of eating has never been just about survival. It has always been about trust. And tonight, as we end our journey, we ask the simplest question of all: what have we learned? We've learned that power dines in fear. From Chinese emperors encased in rituals to Roman senators watching their wine change color, to presidents whose meals are tracked from farm to fork, those who rule never eat alone. They eat with protocol. They eat with hesitation, because a throne may rise from conquest, but it can fall in a teacup. In every palace, food has been the most private and the most vulnerable part of power, because it goes past armor. It bypasses guards. It is welcomed in. We've learned that food tasters were more than testers. They were mirrors to fear, symbols of sacrifice. They didn't just taste for poison, they absorbed anxiety. Their job was never to say yes. It was to say not yet. To hold off death for one more course, one more hour, one more day. And when they succeeded, no one noticed. When they failed, everyone remembered. That's the truth of silence. We've learned that poison evolves, but intent stays the same. It doesn't matter if it's arsenic in a fig or a nerve agent on a doorknob. The goal is always control. To take something intimate, eating, and make it terrifying. To turn the act of nourishment into a weapon. And often, it works. Because a poisoned dish doesn't just kill the body, it shatters confidence. It infects the mind. We've learned that some meals are messages. A feast prepared for reconciliation. A dinner staged as a trap. A final glass of wine offered. With a smile, knowing what it contains. And sometimes, the message isn't for the one who eats. It's for those watching. Look what I can do. Look who I can reach. The fork, in these moments, becomes a pen, and the plate, a signature. We've learned that some meals are prayers. Quiet, trembling hands bringing toast to lips before execution. A bowl of soup shared between rebels before battle. A last bite chosen not for flavor, but for meaning. And in those moments, food becomes holy. Not because of religion, but because of memory. Because that bite, however small, says, I am still here. I am still human. I choose this. And perhaps most of all, we've learned that every table is a reflection of the world it sits in. Where there is fear, there will be tasters. Where there is ambition, there will be poisoners. And where there is love, there will. Be someone who watches your food, not to harm you, but to protect you. Even today, in homes and halls far from palaces, the act of feeding someone is still the most intimate way of saying, I want you to live. That's why betrayal through food cuts so deep, because we only eat with those we trust. And when that trust is broken, no feast can repair it. So tonight, dear listener, as your eyes grow heavy, remember this. Every bite has a story. Every meal leaves a trace. And somewhere across time, someone always sat in silence, tasting for someone else. Not to be remembered, but so they wouldn't be mourned. Sleep now. The table is cleared. The story remains.